Tavi, what is that?
What?
Right there?
That's not safe. Experimental. Very dangerous.
Yeah, I know, but can it fly?
Woo! Hello everybody and welcome to the Gaming Ground, your source for movie reviews, mixed martial arts, and of course the reason why you even clicked this video to start with gaming. And for today's video, I'm going to be talking about Capcom's Dark Void. It's been 13 years later, and this game is still a piping hot pile of garbage. And you know, it really bothers me because I wanted to like this game. And I'm not a big fan of the whole angry reviewer shtick. I don't really see a point in bringing up a video game that is over 10 years old, that's long and forgotten, only to tell people that, yeah, you were right to completely forget about that game's existence. What is the point of that? Well, guess what? I played it, and it is in fact shit. So I guess my hands are pretty tied here, which does bother me because for 2010, in the 7th generation, Dark Void is a really innovative concept and a title. When you think about it, most shooters coming out at the time were grim, dark, and edgy military shooters, where the primary color palette was gray, brown, and black, and the tone in the atmosphere was like some post-war Vietnam flashback, which is okay some of the times, but all the time I don't want to be getting secondhand depression every time I play a shooting game. And you got to factor in that all the gameplay mechanics back then were cover-based, where you're stuck playing stop and pop gameplay to facilitate the use of a gamepad in a shooting game. And here Dark Void was with a completely unique tone and atmosphere. And this was a game that I dare say was blatantly plagiarizing The Rocketeer, which is a good thing because The Rocketeer is a really fun movie with a really exciting tone and atmosphere that models itself off of like Indiana Jones or Captain America. And that's a really fun formula. I also like the idea of having your core gameplay mechanic be based around the use of a jetpack. Jetpacks are awesome. I think we've all heard our boomer parents at one point talk about how they always dreamed about using a jetpack when they grew up. And this game is entirely based around that premise. And there's something appealing to me about that because that means that Capcom's main goal for this game was to make a third-person shooter with the best mobility and movement options you could possibly imagine. Now, guess what? They didn't really succeed in that regard, and it's a bit of a bummer. If you look up Dark Void right now on Metacritic, you'll notice that the game averages around a 5.6 out of 10 across every major platform it was reviewed on. So why would I even give this game a chance when it was so poorly received by professional critics? Well, to tell you the truth, professional critics kind of suck. It's become a meme at this point, but the professional critic response on Rotten Tomatoes is one of the least useful things you could use to decide if a movie or a special is actually worth watching. And this is especially true in the gaming industry, where professional reviewers have been dropping the ball for decades. Let me repeat that again, for decades. God Hand is considered a cult classic. It's a game that perfectly translates the 2D beat-em-up formula from games like Streets of Rage or Final Fight successfully into the third dimension. And it does it in style, but when God Hand first came out, it was infamously rated a 3.5 out of 10 by IGN. That poor critical reception basically killed God Hand as a franchise and any chances we could ever see of having a sequel. So if you could excuse me for having a chip on my shoulder when it comes to professional critics, they're killing awesome games. They almost killed Nier. When Nier first came out, it was hated by professional critics. It's only thanks to the fans writing petitions to Square Enix that we ever got a sequel to the game. And this is even noticeable in the film industry. Scarface, one of the greatest gangster movies of all time, was infamously hated by critics when it first came out. It's great nowadays and it has a good reputation, but how wrong were they? Scarface is the primary inspiration behind Grand Theft Auto, the highest grossing and selling video game of all time. So if you can excuse me when I'm a little shocked for the fact that the professional critics actually for once in their life, got it right with Dark Void. I'm surprised as you are. In a matter of fact, one thing that both critics and fans unanimously agree upon is that the only decent bit of content to come out of the Dark Void brand was the spin-off game. Dark Void Zero was sold as this long lost and forgotten NES classic that was revived and revitalized only on the Nintendo DSiWare store. And Capcom was a master at selling nostalgia as a gimmick at this point in time. This game came right after the release of Mega Man 9 and 10. So needless to say, I bet you they had plenty of people on staff that knew how to make an old school 2D 8-bit shooter. And the game definitely succeeded in that regard. But I want to put things into perspective for a second. The original Dark Void was a near AAA title. It's a game that had professional writers, thousands of people making 3D models and level designs, all for that to be overshadowed by the promotional content that was probably churned out by 5 interns on a weekend game jam. Ouch! Before I get into what makes Dark Void such a horrible experience, I gotta get shameless self-promotion out of the way. Please like, comment, and subscribe to the Gaming Grappler. The more my channel grows, the more time, effort, and energy I can put into delivering you guys content on a consistent and regular basis. But without further ado, let's get into it. The performance for this game is terrible, at least on the version I ended up playing. Now, originally, I wanted to play this game on PC for the sole reason that A, it would be easier to record, and B, if I'm going to play a shooting game, I'm going to want to use a keyboard and a mouse. And for those that don't know, let me summarize this as quickly as I can. A mouse is the best way to aim in a shooting game. It offers a full range of movement where you can make subtle and snappy movements. This is because you can use your whole wrist along with your arm. On the other hand, a gamepad, you're stuck with an analog stick, which has a small range of movement, and your thumb will never be as fast and as accurate as your hand. And you can definitely see that reflected in my gameplay footage. It almost looks like it's my first time playing a shooting game, because it almost is my first time playing a shooting game. For the last 10 or so years, I've been exclusively playing every first-person and third-person shooter with the convenience and use of a keyboard and mouse. And going back to a gamepad is one of the most gimped ways I could ever go about playing one of these games. It almost feels like I'm playing with one arm tied behind my back, so keep that in mind when you look at this footage here. With that being said, I couldn't find this game legitimately on any online vendor. This game was discontinued on Steam as a service, which is a huge red flag in and of itself, and I'm not even going to bother messing around with the Games for Windows Live version. That's a terrible service, and I'm not even sure it's up in circulation anymore. So I decided to opt instead for the PlayStation 3 version. And we have more red flags here. I got a used copy, but the game looked like it was in mint condition, almost as if no one even bothered to touch it. It was kind of like the vendor was happy to get that garbage out of his store and into my pocket. So that's another red flag right there. Now, when it comes to talking about how poorly Dark Void played on the PlayStation 3, I'm going to speak as briefly as possible for the simple reason that I'm not sure if the Xbox 360 or PC version of this game suffer from the same performance issues. And while the game does have negative reviews across the board, I'm not certain if those reviews reflect the game's innate gameplay mechanics or how poorly it was optimized for the respective platform it was released on. But for PlayStation 3, it should be known that this game runs like complete shit. For starters, the frame rate is terrible on every major set piece in this game. And there are a lot of set pieces in Dark Void. The frame rate dropped to like 15 frames per second and became borderline unplayable at certain segments, and this happened frequently. There were also a lot of game-breaking bugs, like bugs that prevented me from progressing, where I actually had to kill my character to restart the level, or I had to turn off my console. This happened multiple times on my original playthrough. We're talking stuff like clipping through the ground and falling into the skybox. Again, the game just runs like complete garbage. But I have more criticisms for this game besides the way the game was optimized for the PlayStation 3. There are a lot of core mechanical problems that actually prevent this game from being fun and enjoyable. And what I mean to say is you could still have a good game under the hood of a bad port. Sonic the Hedgehog for the Game Boy Advance is one of the worst ways you could experience the original Sonic the Hedgehog. But the core game is still good. It's just the bad port that does it a disservice. Now, when we talk about Dark Void, there is no good game under the hood. It sucks across the board. Dark Void sells itself as a fast-paced third-person shooter with good movement options. Now, the game doesn't succeed at doing any of that, but when we criticize Dark Void, the core thing we're talking about, if we had to narrow it down, is that the game has bad combat mechanics. And one of the worst aspects of Dark Void's combat is the enemy design. And this is not just a superficial complaint. This game bills itself as a fast-paced shooter. And in a fast-paced shooter, you need good enemy design. You have to convey a lot of information to the player, and you have to do it quickly. The most frequent enemy type you'll be fighting in Dark Void are slender metallic drones piloted by slugs. And I don't know if this is just me, but robots are one of the most boring enemy types in video games. I mean, think about it. You're not fighting a person or an alien with motives and thoughts and opinions. You're fighting a machine that came off of an assembly line. It doesn't feel like you actually beat someone. It feels like you're taking out the trash. And one of the reasons that robots are one of the most unsatisfying things you could fight in a video game is that they don't bleed. I know this sounds like psychopathic, but think about this for a second. The reason why games like Doom or Gears of War are full of blood and gore is that blood and gore is a visual indication that the player is doing damage. The player is visually seeing the progress that they're doing in a fight, and there's a dopamine reward for doing that. But when you shoot a robot, what do you see? Sparks? I mean, it just sucks. So yeah, big problem. The most frequent enemy type you'll be fighting in this game gives you the most unsatisfying combat. The bland enemy design isn't just bad conceptually, it's bad mechanically. Like, the game's combat actually gets worse because of how poorly designed these enemies are. Let me explain. My biggest issue in Dark Void is that in every combat scenario, it physically hurt my eyes to play this game. And I have played a lot of fast-paced, janky, first-person shooters, games like Ultra Kill, Doom Eternal, or Proteus. These are all fast games that give a lot of people motion sickness, but not for me. But my main issue with Dark Void is that the generic enemy designs, the robots, are so hard to see. You have to spend a good 50% of the time playing Where's Waldo while squinting as much as you can. It hurts your eyes and it gets draining. Think about what you're fighting here. You're fighting a slender, slim, metallic chrome robot that are fought mostly on chrome spaceships, so they blend into everything. And it doesn't help that they have that generic Michael Bay Transformers look to them, where they look like they were assembled with leftover scrapyard pieces. They're blended into everything. Even in jungle environments, these guys are still hard to spot because their silhouette is so skinny that they're hard to notice. A huge percentage of the time, the only reason I knew I was getting a hit confirm was because my cursor changed the color red. I'm pretty sure that's not what Capcom intended when they designed this game. Even then, that's still not necessarily a good strategy because for whatever reason, Capcom felt the need to put a transparency filter on every aspect of this game's UI. From the aiming reticle to the subtitles, everything is see-through. And in a chaotic game like this, it's like they did everything in their power to make my eyeballs bleed. Gaming is a visual medium. The way you see things matters a lot. Just a heads up here, I'm going to be reiterating a lot of the same points I made in my Project Warlock video, especially when it comes to silhouetting and how it makes a huge difference in combat. So you might want to check out that video, but the point is really prudent when I talk about Dark Void, and even more so in this case. So the gist of it is there's a huge difference between designing a fast-paced shooter and a slow-paced shooter. And a slow-paced shooter would be something like Metal Gear Solid 4 or 5, where the game is designed to be more tactical and realistic, where the player has to slowly plot their way through their environments, go prone, and crawl and make their way through their surroundings. And while they're doing that, they have the time and breath of fresh air to decide how they want to either ignore the enemies, take them out, and the result of that slow-paced gameplay is that Hideo Kojima can be sneaky, and he can camouflage certain enemies and be really deceptive about their enemy placement. And that works because the game is slow and the player has plenty of breathing room to make those types of decisions. Fast-paced shooters like Doom Eternal or Vanquish have the complete opposite approach when it comes to combat and level design. It has the complete opposite approach because staying put in these games and taking things slow means death. And it means death because enemies are usually incredibly powerful and incredibly mobile. They don't die in one hit, and they require a unique strategy in order to defeat them. To compensate for this deficiency, players are given an enormous arsenal with plenty of movement options to make use of that arsenal. Players can usually boost and dash in and out of cover. In some games like Vanquish, you're even offered a time slowdown mechanic. And in games like Doom, you don't even have to reload. So you have the opportunity to be out in the open as frequently and as often as you want. Since the combat is fast and the player is so vulnerable when they slow down and stay behind cover, the player is incentivized to make life or death decisions in microseconds. To facilitate that decision-making process, developers were smart enough to make sure that every enemy type in the game had a unique and distinctive silhouette to them. Every enemy has its own unique shape or amalgamation of shapes, to the point that your lizard brain will recognize what you're looking at before you're even consciously aware of it. The end result, the player can make micro decisions without any difficulty. First off, let's get this straight. Dark Void is a fast-paced shooter. Yes, there are moments where you are stuck hiding behind cover using stop and pop gameplay, but that was mostly because this game came out in the 7th generation and it had to facilitate the use of a gamepad. This is before PC gaming took off as a whole, so they had to make a lot of concessions to sell these types of games to the masses. Keep in mind, the main selling point for Dark Void is the jetpack. And what is a jetpack? Mobility options. In gameplay, you can use your jetpack in two different ways. You can take off vertically and hover in the air, or you can piece the F out and fly around like a spaceship and go wherever you want on the map. In addition to that, you have some goofy, powerful sci-fi weapons. So yeah, by every metric, I would say Dark Void is categorized as a fast-paced shooter. In high-level gameplay, players will rarely stay stuck behind cover. My biggest issue with Dark Void is that it's a fast-paced shooter with slow-paced combat mechanics, and the two of them do not gel together very well. And listen here, I don't care if it was intentional or accidental. At the end of the day, most enemies in this game all look the same. They're usually slender, metallic robots. They all have the same silhouette, and they're all camouflaged into the background. And since this is a fast-paced game, you don't have the time to accurately make micro decisions in heated combat scenarios. The only enemies that are visually distinct in this game are the mini-bosses and the bosses themselves. But those guys suck for different reasons. They suffer from the 7th generation problem where the boss is just a giant monster that's a bullet sponge. And the only way to beat them is to shoot the glowing red weak spot. Great job, guys. You really phoned it in there. On PlayStation 3, this game is a visual clusterfuck. There are a lot of action set pieces. And in all those set pieces, the frame rate drops to like 15 frames per second. While that's happening, you're playing Where's Waldo, trying to snipe at the generic tin can robots. You don't even know what you're shooting at unless your cursor turns red. And while that's all happening, sometimes you have to go through your Ace Combat flight simulation sections where you don't know what's up, what's down. You're getting a headache, and this game just makes me want to vomit. All right, now I'm going to get into the more mechanical side to what really nerfs the combat in this game. One of the biggest problems in Dark Void is that while there are some cool sci-fi inspired weapons in this game, you can only use 2 of them at a time, and I don't really get it. Was realism really a priority in the game where you zip around, flying around in a jetpack fighting aliens in the Bermuda Triangle? And don't just tell me that, oh, it's because this game was intended to be played on consoles. I see 2 extra buttons on that D-pad there. You should be at least able to hold 4 weapons at once, which would be alright, but there's still no reason to not have a quick menu where you could switch to more weapons on the fly. Doom came out in 1993, and you could switch between like 10 weapons in that game. I fully believe Capcom in 2010 could find a way to make it work. So let's get into the real meat and potatoes here. The main reason why people were even excited for this game when it was coming out was the jetpack. How does this game handle flying? Well, for the first 45 minutes or so of this game, you barely even get to use the jetpack. You get a nerfed version of it, but when you do finally get it, it does significantly open up the combat potential. You have 2 different modes of using the jetpack. You can fly vertically in the air and hover in place to snipe enemies in the third-person shooter sections, or you can take off and zip around like you're playing an Ace Combat simulator. The most fun you'll have playing Dark Void are on all the set pieces dedicated around the use of the jetpack. When these moments happen, the game usually has a stable frame rate, and the game plays something like Ace Combat, where you can jack enemy aircraft and safely leave them and bail on them whenever you want. They're the most well-designed aspects of the game. My main criticism when it comes to Dark Void is that the game has two styles of gameplay and it rarely blends them well in an effective way. The choice is quite binary. You're either playing a really shit third-person shooter or a mediocre ace combat game. Using the jetpack and trying to move fast in the third-person shooter sections will often result in player death. And I mean, I'm sure it's possible, but whenever I tried to use it, I ended up getting punished for it. The entire appeal and fantasy of a jetpack game is that there should be so many mobility options that by the time the player masters them all, they become significantly overpowered. What this game is missing is some short-ranged dash move that lets the player quickly zip around the battlefield in a safe and effective manner. There should also be some sort of awesome melee weapon in the game. The fact it's not here is a jarring omission. By the end of the game, you should feel like you're Iron Man. But by the end of Dark Void, you won't feel like a superhero. You'll feel like you're Wile E. Coyote strapped to a fucking Acme rocket.